fourth, third.
Yes. We did. I was just talking to her yesterday. She's
Okay.
coming now.
Yeah.
Very good.
Excellent.
Wonderful. Don't be shy. Do come sit more. Oh my God, that's loud. Come do sit forwards as well. Okay. All right, well, thank you very much to all of you who are in the room today, and also I understand a few of you joining online. Very grateful for you all for taking the time to come here, virtually or in person. My name is Dr. Marius Ostrowski. I am Executive Director of the Lifelong Education Institute. Very grateful for King's College London for hosting us today for a really important and timely discussion on international students and immigration. We'll have all seen the news stories that have been circulating the last couple of weeks. Essentially, if we can boil it down to its most essential point, it is the concern, frame that how you will, about the presence of international students as in some way posited as a gateway to uncontrolled migration to the UK. That is the fear, if you like, that is the notion that has been raised in the media discussion, which certainly can be unpacked and dealt with, and I'm looking forward to having that discussion with the panel today. I don't want to spend too many moments going into long, detailed remarks now, but I wanted to mention a few points which I think will be interesting to consider as we look at this question in greater detail. One is, well, the different perceptions about what international students bring to the UK, particularly looking at the different levels at which students exist, both undergrad, masters, at doctoral level as well. And really important to emphasize that there is no such thing as just one type of international student. They come in many different shapes and sizes and different forms of research that they conduct as well. Different provenances, Europe, North America, as well as South and Central America, Africa and Asia, and each of the experiences of being an international student in the UK will differ based on where they've originally come from and their own personal story and life trajectory through different educational stages. There, of course, part of the discussion in the media is around the new dependency rules that have been elevated for international students, and precisely how those impose restrictions on the ability of people who are researchers and learners abroad to benefit from the really quite world-leading education and research facilities that the UK provides. That I anticipate being a major point of discussion. I look forward to hearing both the panel's comments on it and also your questions about that. Really, one thing we need to consider quite carefully is what role international students and researchers play in the scale and the character of the world-leading research that the UK produces. International academics based in the UK and the international partners that UK academics have as well. And the way that in the knowledge that can be brought into the UK system, what directions it can take the research agenda of UK higher education in as well. Graduate routes into higher impact, high skilled sectors are of course one of the major discussion points here as well. We have an arrow, if you like, between learning and research into productive and also inclusive economic activity within the UK, and looking at what directions people go, whether they use the UK higher education system as a route into working and contributing to the UK economy, whether they use it as a way station, whether, for instance, they use it as a route to pass into other economies or other sectors of the economy, globally speaking, as well. And also really looking at the labour market. One of the big questions within the labour market today is where there are skills gaps. And if we think of the education system, including the higher education system, as a matter of matching skills supply to skills demand, what role can international students play in filling the gaps that exist within the UK economy? And vice versa, what can the UK export as well to the skills gaps in other countries? Finally, we also need to pay careful attention to the barriers that international students and their dependents face, the ones they have to overcome in order to work and to live in the UK. We're talking here, of course, about visas, we're familiar to some of you, to sponsorship, to housing, to funding. And these are live questions. They're not just abstract questions of policy. They're questions which are very personally important to people that we know. They may, in several cases, have been important to us ourselves. So thinking of both the large-scale societal dimension, but also the personal dimension of what this means is going to be really, really important. And without further ado, I'm going to move on to an absolutely stellar lineup of speakers who will go into this in greater detail, starting with Lord Joe Johnson, who's chair of FutureLearn, moving straight on afterwards to Dr. Tania Lima, who's Director of Global Engagement in this parish, at King's College London, and finally, Professor Steve McGuire, Dean of the University of Sussex Business School. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to the panel for joining us, and I'll hand straight over to Lord Johnson. Thank you.
Okay. Well, good afternoon. A pleasure to be here. Thank you, Marius, for that introduction and your excellent opening remarks. I'm not sure if you wanted us to say a few words or if you want to kick off with some questions. Okay, well.
Please do.
Great. I didn't want to trouble you with extended opening remarks, but I can say a few things on an impromptu basis. I think this overall point that I would like to make is that there was a very strong political consensus in favour of continued growth in international student recruitment, international students on campus in the UK in 2019, when the graduate route was reintroduced, it having been abolished in its previous incarnation by Theresa May in 2011. Strong consensus that we benefited from international students on campus, both as universities and more broadly as an economy and as a society. That consensus over the most recent 4 years has weakened considerably, and it's weakened for a number of reasons. It's weakened because there is a sense that there is some sort of fragility in the model in a number of ways. Universities are regarded as having become over-reliant on recruitment from a couple of countries, China and India, which has left them less resilient financially than they otherwise might be, and led to a lack of diversity on campus, which is seen by some as negative for the learning experience. So there's the concentration of the international student body from two big sending countries in Asia. That's one area that's caused concerns about about the benefits which are otherwise well understood. Another concern has been that there is some weakness in the documentation of the maintenance support funds that international students need to have to exist and to enjoy themselves when they're in this country. There is a body of evidence that too many international students are underfunded on arrival because they actually don't have access to the maintenance support funds which they needed to have in making their visa application. So there is a sense that that system needs to be tightened up so international students don't find themselves in hardship, unable to cope with the challenging cost of living here in the UK. A couple of other reasons. I would say, on the immigration point, which Marius mentioned, concern that actually for a number of students, the primary motivation for coming to the UK is not so much to benefit from the higher education that our institutions offer, but primarily to seek a immigration route through the country, into the country. And that is quite a fundamental concern that's driving a lot of the rhetoric on the right of the party. And then a more recent concern, finally, has arisen around the idea that international students are displacing domestic students from sought-after places on a number of courses at universities which domestic students might have hitherto got into. Now, this is a concern which is by and large misplaced, and nonetheless it's increasingly sticking in the popular narrative. And if the sector wants to address this particular concern, it does need to work harder at getting its message across that the vast majority of international students are coming in the masters, at master's level, which is not where the bulk of domestic students are concentrated. But anyway, those are the four big concerns that have led to the weakening of the consensus politically in Westminster. There are a number of things that I think the sector could be doing to get ahead of the political cycle before governments feel under pressure to impose further restrictions on the rules governing international student recruitment by universities. Marius mentioned the announcement in May this year, which saw the government remove the right to bring dependents from all taught master's students. Undergrads were previously unable to bring dependents anyway, but that right was taken away from taught master's students, and it remains only for doctoral students. Now, I think there is a serious risk that further restrictions might be imposed if the sector doesn't get ahead of those 4 sets of concerns that I outlined just a second ago. I think there are some easy things to do. Tightening up the system of documentation around maintenance support funds, I think, is a no-brainer. Canada, as some of you may know, has a system called the GIC, the Guaranteed Investment Certificate, which is a financial instrument that a bank will provide a student once the student has deposited their maintenance support funds required for the first year of study. The student can draw down on those funds during the course of the academic year. That way, the student can demonstrate beyond doubt that he or she has the funds that they claim to have, and put that question totally beyond doubt. I think there is also a case for regulatory action. It's a bit of a lacuna in our system at the moment that domestic students are rigorously quality assured by the Office for Students in terms of their continuation rates, their completion rates, and how they progress into either further education or employment. But when it comes to international students, we don't apply the same rigor. So we assess continuation rates, we assess completion rates, but we don't require universities actually to account for how international students progress. And I think that's a gap. Where institutions, this is not because they can't do it, it's they're actively choosing not to do it. Business schools, for example, which see a clear interest in advertising to prospective students the kind of salary markup they will get on leaving the business school, are quite capable of finding out what their alumni are doing post-graduation. And I think the rest of the system should be required to do that as well. There are various other reforms which I think the sector could put in place to get ahead of the political cycle. But I worry that if the sector stays in a kind of reactive mode, more will be done to it, and it won't necessarily be the right kind of policies and the right kind of things for the success of international students in the UK in years ahead, which we all want to see. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. All right, Tania, over to you.
Yes. So thank you. I'm from King's and from the Global Engagement Office, and that is this international office at King's. It's a central unit that supports our faculties and our staff, students in their internationalization strategies. And as you can imagine, then I'm here to say to you that we are very keen to become even more internationally engaged. And you will see, it's clear why, but I'll try to tell you a bit about what's happening here and at King's and in the sector in general. We are trying to develop more education programs. They are co-developed with our international partners, therefore creating a curriculum that is more global in its outlook and in its content and the kind of discussions and outcomes that come out of these education programs and opportunities such as internship or lectures and academics that we bring here from different parts of the world and ours going to our partners all over the world to enrich the experience that our students and our staff have here on campus, and also the creation of research networks, synergistic partners that complement our strengths, address gaps, and therefore help and essential to address the very serious global challenges that we all face. And of course, every university is an international community. It has been like this since the beginning. When you think the first university in Bologna in Italy, created in the Middle Ages around the year 1000, was already an international place. There were already international students there and academics coming from all over the world. And if you think, that was when we had travel as easy as it is now, and technology enabling exchanges, and globalization, and the need to connect to address global challenges. So we should be growing into this very prosperous, productive, important community and ecosystem, because then it creates a virtuous cycle. The more the diversity brings richer discussions, creation of knowledge that is more impactful, and therefore attracting better and better minds. So we all want to have these sort of ecosystems on our campus, and we do that. UK is very good at attracting talent and from all over the world, both in terms of students, but also our academics, staff in general, creating these very interesting places to be, I have to say. And just to give you an idea about King's, of our approximately 45,000 students now, 47% are international students. And 45% of our staff is not from the UK. It's indeed true that our master students are more than about, I would say, 55% of our master students are international. The UK average is around 67% of master students are international students. Our PhDs, about 43% of our PhDs are international students coming from more than 150 countries. So think about what happens here every day. You have this community of 150 different nationalities interacting, sharing their lived experience. We all carry with us a bit of our countries, of our families, history, music, food, literature, cinema, this wealth of experiences and things that, perspectives that we bring together and can share and learn from each other. And we are sure, we see this. It creates people with better worldviews, more equipped to address and engage critically with new information and producing knowledge that is really more relevant and more impactful. And to us, as important is the kind of people that then develop here. Not only students, staff, we are always learning as well. And we tend to fear what we don't know. By putting all of this different and this diversity together, what we realize is that, yes, you're bringing different perspectives. I value that, but also we have a lot more in common than what separates us. This sense of humanity that we all share is here every day on our campus. And with this, it brings this sense of empathy, of respect, of understanding different knowledge systems. Of course, we have to do more about integration, and I'll talk about it a little bit, but I feel that, particularly in London, it feels that we, on top of being a diverse community on our campus, we are in a very diverse city, of course, and we say, come to London and see the world, and it's true, and we can provide a very interesting, I think, and important interaction between the communities that we have around our campuses and in London, and how our students, our staff can impact and vice versa, be impacted by these international experiences around us. But we cannot, this is important and it's going well. We should become even more international, I think. But there are challenges too. We need to be aware that international, particularly international students, international staff as well, but international students face a very specific set of challenges. If you think to decide to study abroad, already in itself, we are selecting people that are curious, adventurous, entrepreneurs, because think what it means to leave behind everything you knew, kind of, and then be curious and resilient and motivated enough to face this big challenge. And it's a long journey. If you think you have to be lucky enough to be born in a place where either your family or your government or some scholarship or a donation allowed you to afford to come here, spend some time here, then you have to do well at school, learn a second language, English, really well to pass these really intensive English tests that we have now, and then you manage to get a visa, very far from being a simple process, then you finally arrived. It feels like, gosh, this was really a complicated journey of all the factors that had to be in place for it to happen. And then you come here, and it can be really, really lonely and challenging. It's our job to facilitate and create an environment where you are going to integrate and exchange, and we learn from each other in this very diverse community. We are not doing as well as we should. We have to admit there is much more than we can do to integrate and really make good of this diversity that we have here. We are trying a little bit. So we have our fabulous student societies. There are more than 200 of them, but the problem is that if you are at the Society of the French Student Society, it tends to attract French students. And then you have the Japanese Student Society with Japanese students. And we are trying to create a way and provide incentives that these societies then actually attract the other, right? And do more things together. And also creating more interactive projects that will facilitate and in the classroom and outside the classroom, so that we have a truly global classroom. We already have global classroom in terms of nationalities, but it's not as an education experience is not as global, I think, informed by the diversity in the classroom as it should be. And if we do our job well, some of our students will catch the academic bug and the research bug, and they will stay to do a PhD here. We are already good at attracting PhD students. If you think at King's, almost half of our PhD students are international, but in some STEM subjects in the UK, you have more than 80% of PhD students being international, and the average for the UK is at least half. Think about how important international students have been to produce knowledge and be part of this research community that the UK is really and should be very proud of. And there is a risk now. We see a trend of fewer international PhDs coming to the UK. This is very worrying for us in the long term, not only because it will have an impact on the kind of knowledge that we produce, but even the education that we provide here. We are a research-intensive university, and we truly believe that learning and knowledge are developed together. One really cannot exist without the other, and we truly believe that a student being taught and in contact with an academic, with a lecturer that is deeply engaged with research, the education, what happens there, the teaching and learning, will be very different. And the way of thinking, reading, writing, interrogating a problem is informed by the rigor of the research method. And also will equip the student to apply those skills in their job markets, even if in their jobs, in their future jobs. You don't have to stay in academia. Those skills are valued across any job. So I truly hope that we can all together work towards not going down this trend that we are going to have fewer international students, but particularly fewer PhD students on our campus. We know that student outcomes are enhanced by this diversity of research perspectives that we have on our campus. The diversity generates creativity. The quality of what and the impact of what is produced is very, very different. I really cannot imagine a university that has fewer international students and international academics in it. It would be such a poor place to study, to work. We would be far, far poorer, and our research would be far less impactful. I think at the moment, we cannot ignore the concerns of our fellow citizens about immigration. There are concerns also about sustainable business models. We cannot just say, well, this really doesn't matter. It does matter. We need to address and be rigorous about this. But let's not this be the driver of economic benefits. I think the driver should be that diversity is good because multiculturalism is good. And in terms of outcomes for society, I consider myself extremely lucky to be part of this community. And I hope that we all together can continue to create an enabling mechanism and communities that allow all of us to thrive. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tania. And finally, over to Steve.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. And thank you very much for inviting me to this event. So let me just, the brief I was sort of given was to talk a bit more about economic benefits and graduate outcomes, and I'll do a bit of that. I'll speak a bit about some comparative perspectives. Please don't mistake this for a research paper. This is really very much a series of observations from somebody who does do a lot of international work. In addition to being dean at Sussex, I'm also on the university executive, and I'm familiar with all the debates around, and we too are grappling with some of the pressures that Lord Johnson has outlined. So I'll give you some comparative data, and I hope it will put you in, at least some bits of it will put you in a fine mood. So why do we like international students? Let me just start from, set out my stall initially. First and foremost, because it's an intrinsic good. Universities have always been, as far as I can recall, cosmopolitan places, and this is something that we need to preserve, and I think we've seen that reflected in the panel tonight. I was an international student decades ago. The reason the UK now suffers me is because I came over as a graduate student in the 1990s. So there's nothing new about it. Flows and the increase in flows are an issue. We have to grant that. Over the past few years, it is certainly true in various jurisdictions, and the UK is not unique in this. Foreign international student fees have effectively supplanted or supplemented the spending, compensated for the spending constraint in domestic economies. And again, that's not particularly new. Any Americans in the group will know if you chose to study out of state, you pay out of state fees, which is exactly the same thing as an international fee. One of the important reasons I think that's almost understated or mischaracterized poorly, I think, in the UK debate is the soft power argument and the goodwill. I think this is immensely important. I benefit from it when I go out and negotiate, for example, a research collaboration. It helps that you're sitting across a table from somebody who did their PhD at Warwick. Not least because you don't have to translate sort of into North Americanese, where a program is a degree, a course is a module, and all this jazz. It seems trivial, in many respects it is, but it's actually quite important, that sitting down that first meeting and knowing. But here's the other and frankly far more important reason. I encounter students, whether it's PhD students, for example, or academic faculty. This country is widely admired for having a comparatively depoliticized higher education system that is transparent, is rules-based, and is, well, by and large, very fair. That's unusual. Ask somebody from many countries, including those on the continent, what their experience, say, moving up through the academic ranks in many countries is. And it's very different from ours. So it's really important, I think, that we understand just what we have here and how admired we are as a system in terms of higher education governance. And of course, there's the immigration debate. I will say the UK is not unique, but it's unusual. Other countries do have a very, very direct view about international student recruitment being a route for immigration. And I'll say a bit more about that in a second. So how do international students do in the labor market? Well, in the UK, they do rather well. ONS data would suggest that the median salary for a non-EU international student, whatever qualification, is something on the order of about 13% higher than domestic students. And we can speculate as to why that might be, but the evidence that we have available suggests that they do a very good job of getting into the labor market and getting well-paid jobs. And I think actually this city is I'll get to the punchline, I think this city has a particular role to play in that outcome. Most are MSc or MBA. Many of them will have done a first undergraduate degree and then got a more specialist master's at an institution like King's or Sussex or wherever that really does match their skills, their desires to the job market. Most are in business subjects, but also engineering and computer science, i.e. professions. But lest anybody think I'm a particular, I know what people think about business school deans. When I go to Shanghai and see our alumni, I am stunned at the number of wonderfully successful people working in the creative industries in cities like Shanghai, for example. And so it's across the board a success, but it is true that international students tend to cluster in a relatively narrow set of disciplines. If this sounds familiar, it's because it's a lot like British students. The largest group of British students in terms of degree study is business. So comparative data, just to sort of give you some indication. We seem to do better than Canada or Australia on providing appropriate level of graduate jobs, matching graduate skills. In both Australia and Canada, there was some debate about underemployment of graduates, of international graduates. In Canada, no prizes for guessing where I'm from, right? There's actually some pretty good recent data on this suggesting that international students actually do worse in the Canadian labor market. They pull it back, but they do pay a penalty for about 5 years. That doesn't seem to be in the UK data, which is really interesting and a good news story for us. But again, similarly, Canadian and Australian international students cluster in cities. They tend to put pressure, they can put pressure on housing stock. And I think this is a real issue in the UK at the moment. But it predates the growth of international students. It's been made much worse in this case by the growth of international students. But all of us in the university sector, we should have been on this earlier as we increased domestic undergraduate numbers over the past 10 years, really. We effectively, my view, outsourced the accommodation function to the private sector, and that was a mistake. Canada, as Lord Johnson suggested, has a pretty good system for monitoring the financial viability of candidates, but nonetheless, there have been some really dreadful instances in that country around lack of accommodation, lack of affordability. And so Canada, watch this space, is even now tightening regulations around this. And again, linking to one of Lord Johnson's points, is putting a much greater onus on post-secondary institutions for the monitoring and care, not duty of care, that means something very specific, but care of international students. I have no view on that, I'm just telling you it's happening. So, conclusions just from my perspective. You can imagine, I'm in favor of international students. We are an aging society. In fact, most of the OECD is aging rapidly. We have skills shortages. You might have seen in the FT, earlier this week. Again, a pretty good analysis around the skills shortages that we have in the UK. And they are currently being addressed, at least partially, by highly qualified international students who do well in our labor market. So the UK does better than others. And I think, again, London has an important role to play on this. But that suggests something problematic, potentially, about the leveling up agenda. It would be good to see more highly skilled international graduates stay in other parts of the country, just as it's true with domestic students. There really isn't that much difference. So I really very much hope we keep the doors open, but I think we also have to recognize the pressures. They are not unique to us. Ask anybody at the University of Toronto, and they will tell you about very acute housing pressures in that city as well. So it's not unique, but we have to get a handle on it. And I would welcome also a broader debate about how we put UK higher education on a more sustainable funding model. We are more toward the spectrum of high levels of private funding as distinct from government funding. That's what it is. The Canadian system and Australia work a slightly different basis. But nonetheless, we may want to revisit. There are very strong incentives at the moment for international student recruitment. I accept that. Dealing with that also requires a good conversation about how we fund home students. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all members of the panel for those wonderful contributions. It is now time for Q&A, and as I always do in these situations, I encourage you to be as forthright and provocative. There is no such thing as a stupid question, or maybe there are some things that are stupid questions, but please ask anything that you feel is relevant to the situation. And in the traditional form, no one is volunteering to go first. So I have one. Oh, no, oh, sorry. I'm sorry, I missed one. Over to you, Yolanta. Please, go for it. And please say who you are as well before you start. That's a great question. I'll actually add the one that I was going to ask into there because it's kind of on the similar kind of note, which is in the sense that we've heard from multiple sides, I suppose, of the fact that universities are diverse communities, international communities within, often clustered within, diverse cities. But to what extent do the communities actually engage with each other? How much do universities and their members engage with the full membership of the community around them? And tied into that, if there's a certain duty, shall we say, on the part of universities to prepare international students for what it means to engage with UK society, to what extent is there also a mirroring responsibility for universities to prepare UK society for what it means to have a community of international students within them? Okay, I think that's enough questions at once. So I'll start with Joe first.
Okay. Yes, you're right. I think we probably are all in agreement that international students bring huge benefits to the UK, and so we are all, I'm sure, in this room and maybe online as well, of that opinion. And we do have a challenge in ensuring that the benefits are more broadly understood. Because there is a risk that they get caught up in the general backlash at the moment, and that would be a great shame. That's why I think it's important that research that's been done to demonstrate the economic benefits are broadly shared and communicated by members of Parliament to their constituents, by media, well understood in the media. So I'm referring to the HEPI London Economics Kaplan UK international research, which isolated £41 billion worth of economic value being generated by international students every year, a significant increase on the prior year. So those economic benefits are really strong, and they do need to be understood. And we also need to communicate that international students bring great choice for domestic students, contrary to the myth that they're actually displacing domestic students from prized courses. So the fact is, as Steve was indicating in his remarks, they cross-subsidize loss-making domestic provision, making viable courses that would otherwise not be offered, thereby increasing choice and number of places available for everybody at home as well. That argument really needs to get out there, and the sector does need to do a better job in sort of converting newspapers such as the Telegraph and Mail, which are hammering away on this theme of displacement, and actually try and get the true situation across. But finally, I think the sector also, to some extent, needs to clean house on some of the areas where the concerns are legitimate about the model. So if large numbers of students are dropping out because they're underfunded and they haven't got the wherewithal to support themselves, it's important that proper mechanisms are put in place to ensure that students do have the funds that they claim to have when they're applying for the visa, and they're not putting themselves inadvertently in positions of great hardship. So there are a number of things that need to be done in that respect. I think the sector could support itself in moving to a more sustainable model, for example, by having application fees, as some other countries do, by requiring that tuition fees are paid up front, that maintenance funds required by UKVI, UK Visas and Immigration, are put into an escrow account at the start of the year so that their financial means is beyond doubt. And finally, I think the government has a part to play in updating its advice to international students and its requirements for international students in terms of the maintenance funds which they're required to demonstrate that they have. I think the numbers are probably out of date given the cost of living challenges facing many international students, and a more realistic number is probably required.
Thank you very much, Joe. Tania, over to you.
Yes, I agree. We should get better at telling success stories and the huge benefit that being an international community brings to society as a whole, globally. But indeed, Universities UK, they have commissioned quite a few studies with in the UK about perceptions of international students and immigration. And overall, communities tend to be quite welcoming and receptive towards international students, and in most people's minds there is this distinction of thinking about their issues, if they have any, regarding immigration. It's not the international student is not what they have in mind, but it's true we should do more about this, definitely. I think sometimes we, despite the entire, a very talented community that we have here, we are not good at telling our stories and being proactive about the good and benefits that universities in general generate, and we can only do and have this impact because intrinsically we are these international communities. And rest assured that every university has a dedicated plan of community engagement with dedicated teams and activities and programs. There's still a lot of work to be done for these programs to really impact communities in the long term and have long-term benefits. But it has started, and we have London King's Maths School in London, when our PhD students and academics have created a curriculum of what is now one of the most successful schools in maths and physics education in the country. And you see what happens here, having a direct impact, not to mention our health students and volunteering and the Smile Society and the law clinics and all of that. Should we be doing more? Definitely. Is this the direction of travel? We are aware of that, and we want to do more, and we'll be doing more. So it's a process. We need no longer, I don't think, people feel that we live in this ivory tower. But having turnstiles at the entrance doesn't help either. I remember when I arrived at King's 8 years ago, this was a free place. You could come and go as you wished. But the world is such now that you have, my ID card, and even to enter, you can't anymore. But there are ways around it. We organize the parents groups that come here on the weekends during the week. We realize that parents are driving here, and they feel, is this place for me? What can you do for me? If you bring them here constantly and they understand what happens inside a university, everything becomes, I think, there's more engagement and understanding and admiration reciprocally, I think. But definitely, there is much more that we as a sector should be doing, definitely. We tend to preach to the converter. That's true.
Thank you, Tania. Steve.
Thanks very much. So just a couple of observations. First, as a general rule, I quite agree you should accept when someone has a point and acknowledge that. And I'll go back to accommodation, but explain quickly how this could be tricky. I think in general people feel very warmly toward international students. I can't say that that's uniform across the country, but I think in general they do. But here's a good example of some of the tensions we would have to navigate as a university. Private landlords in Brighton love our students. They love domestic students, they love international students. And in the main, just so we're clear, they do a very good job. But we have, of course, in the private market, we have actually very limited ability to influence aspects of that provision. So my preference as a senior member of a university is to get more of our students onto our accommodation in a structured way. That's very expensive, but that is my goal. That's not going to go down well with our local landlords, right? So one of the interesting problems with many of these, support for many universities and international students rests on some aspects at least are really about things that we would rather we did differently. So just flagging that. In terms of readiness to study, I think it's worth reminding everybody that the large switch in the demographic of international students is really only about 2 or 3 years old. The domination, Chinese students dominated flows for many, many years. There's a very clear demographic. Chinese students tend to come individually, they tend to have means, and they tend to go back to the home country. That's not universally true, but that is generally true. That is much less true of the new the recruits from recruiting areas like India, but also Africa. So it's required adaptations from international offices, and I'm sure King's does this. I'm sure a lot of universities do. We worked very hard, for example, this year to work in country with a lot of agents. We certainly increased our surveillance and activities with agents in countries precisely to identify people who are at risk, because we do not want them here if they then become vulnerable. We'd rather deal with that in country. So I think there will be, I think universities will begin to move some of this back to the country of origin, and we get a better management process around that. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I so far have 3 questions on my list. I encourage also, okay, there's a 4th one there. I, of course, wow, okay, loads now. Well, we have to go through in order, but yes, please, do remember your question and bear it in mind. We'll start with, first for you, then Philip Blond, and then Andy, I think, had one as well. Okay, go for it.
My name is from Coventry University. What would you say to those who say restricting the numbers of international students is a good argument, because high numbers of those students coming here is basically taking away resource from the global south? Picking on what Stephen said, he said we're an aging society. So what would you say to those who have this point of view?
So that's a brain drain or a brain vacuum, so to speak. Okay, Philip.
Yeah, just a thought about challenging the displacement argument. I'm reminded of the Football League that has designated places for UK players whilst in a global market. I'm also reminded that hypothecation remains the only popular form of taxation. And I'm just wondering if you could, given that international students explicitly subsidise domestic provision, is there a way to make what we already do explicit, so that we retain or we require that funds from international students go towards domestic provision or holding places open for domestic students? The advantage of this is I tend to doubt that UK students have been displaced from any course, but I can see in the US, for instance, there's argument about racial quotas, and racial quotas, if they didn't exist, I'm not saying this is accurate, but Asian students would make up 90% of those who get into Harvard. But is there a way to link UK opportunity with international opportunity, such that you can say as an institution, for every international student we recruit, we open up 1 more place or 0.5 of a place for a domestic student? That would seem to me to be quite an effective
All right, thank you, Philip. And Andy, I think you had one as well.
Yeah, I've been reflecting. My father was an international student. He arrived from Jamaica at the end of the Second World War to finish his medical training in Birmingham University. And for the first time I've actually thought of him as an international student, because of course at that time he was a citizen of the United Kingdom and Commonwealth. He didn't have to have any visa requirements or anything like that. And it made me reflect that I'm making very broad statements, that at the end of the Second World War there was a general mood of globalisation and wanting the planet to come together after the Second World War. And yet I sense at the moment that a narrative of global competition has taken root, in which countries like China and India are seen as creeping up, if you like, in some way, in inverted commas, on us. Therefore, educating international students, say I, is educating and giving our competitors skills and knowledge that will enable them to outcompete us. What would you say? And I think that some of the attitudes towards Chinese and other students are being driven by this narrative of global competition, rather than the thing which I instinctively relate to, which is collaboration, the thing that you were talking about, Tania. I love it. But are we in that era anymore? Do we have to recognise that we are now paranoid, right, rather than wanting to celebrate diversity?
Thank you very much. 3 very good questions. I'll go in reverse order this time round. Steve first.
So the observation about the observation about the brain drain. I think, yeah, that's fair. I suppose what we would need to understand longer term is whether these individuals stayed for a period of time or permanently relocated, and what they were doing. So the observation I made about the disciplinary clustering, I could also make actually about rates of international student startups is also increasing. So again, if they start up and do well here, if they went back to their home country, that might be a good thing. So, but I guess I'll just stop there. What we don't really understand, because we've got, it's relatively recent data, is what those students do over a 5 to 10 year period. We've got data for 2 or 3, well, from 2019 really at the moment. So enough said about that, but I think that's an excellent, entirely fair point. And again, it depends upon country. Again, some countries, most international students do return. They don't really consider staying here. It's different for others. Hypothecation. My only observation, I think it's a really interesting idea. My only observation is as a senior academic at a university, the words cross-subsidy are just, no one wants to be cross-subsidized, ever. And I get criticized for even using, I've tried to use fiscal transfers, any other sort of word that might, but fundamentally you can't get around it. So I'm intrigued by the idea, because it would, you're quite right, it would crystallize in people's minds. There is no displacement at the moment. I'm not aware of any. We don't have quotas. We would take any qualify. There's no cap. But I accept the narrative is out there. I do think, by the way, this last admissions round, for what it's worth, universities got it. Remember the commentary before this year's admissions rounds about home students having a real problem? In the main, lots of students who missed their grades actually got into their first choice university.
You could imagine the line, one from outside, one from inside.
Yeah. It appeals to me intellectually. I just don't know how to sell it in language that doesn't make it sound awful, but I fully accept that. Sorry. It's a great idea, but yeah. Global competition, another interesting point. I think that's already very true in the STEM subjects. I think we have a very, very good collaboration in the area of robotics with a Chinese university. I'm not confident we could do that now. So I think the humanities and social sciences is, of course, very different. But I think we're already there on STEM, and in the US has been there for several years around that. And it's unfortunate, because I don't think there's much truth in it, but that is the perception.
Tania.
Well, yeah, I think the key here is to find really a sustainable model for higher education. Right? We are not there, and when you freeze domestic fees for years and years and years, with the inflation as it is, it creates problems for universities, because we need, at the end of the day, you need to think about sustainability of the community. So it's an obligation. Our Vice Chancellor needs to watch out for this. We cannot go bankrupt, and inflation is a reality. And once you cap it and you regulate in this way, you are imposing a certain business model on us that it's hard. But as you can see, despite all these challenges, every university engages in this size and shape, and there isn't any model that is going to, okay, if this is the way we are going to be 100% international. That is not part of any university plan, because we need to engage with our communities, and there is also, we value of course, serving and educating UK students. And in terms of global competition, you don't see this on campus. I tell you, our academics they want to work with the best. Where is the best is where I want to work with and publish and create knowledge that matters. However, here we cannot ignore national security laws, the reality on the ground. So the narrative for us here is, of course, we'll engage, but engage aware. There are certain risks, and most academics use not to pay any attention. Like, oh, this doesn't concern me. All we are doing here is research. It's no longer true. So he has now created an awareness when we hold events in this room about responsible international engagement. We used to have 3 or 4. Now we need to, open this and go to larger auditorium. So it is true, it is happening, but I don't see this as a risk, to be honest, because what I see on the ground is engaging more to address challenges that seem quite big, and we know we cannot do it alone. And to maintain relevance, you cannot ignore that thankfully, other nations are getting quite good at producing knowledge as well. We can't just ignore and say, I won't engage with China, or it's not only a matter of economics, it's a matter of relevance.
Thank you very much. Joe, over to you.
Yeah, on the brain drain point, I think we should be fairly robust in pushing back against that critique of the model of international education. To a great extent, the UK, in welcoming international students, is helping countries that can't satisfy demand for higher education themselves in the volumes and at the level of quality that the students want. And therefore, we're meeting a need, we're meeting a demand that would otherwise be unmet. And I think, as Steve indicated, as long as there is brain circulation resulting from this flow of students, rather than brain drain, I think we can be fairly confident that we've got an ethical model in that sense. Ultimately, the human capital is being enriched and often returning to the country of origin. So I think I'm quite comfortable with the model in that respect. In terms of Philip's idea of quotas, I'm really reluctant to go down that road. I think it would be a terrible intrusion by regulation into one of the last areas of institutional autonomy that remains in our higher education system, namely admissions. There are requirements on universities to think about widening participation and so forth with respect to domestic students, and it's a case to be made that universities should be required to publish plans about their recruitment plans internationally, so that we can be confident that the student body internationally is not going to become dominated by only 1 or 2 countries. But I would be really wary of moving to a sort of one in, one out kind of model for students. I think it would be a real shame if we started othering international students in that way. Lastly, on Andy's excellent point about what are the areas for research collaboration that are going to become out of scope as the geopolitical situation hardens. This is an endlessly shifting definitional question, and the worse things get, the more subjects go beyond the pale of research collaboration. And this is something which Tania and Steve and colleagues across the system are grappling with now on a daily basis, and in urgent need of better and more timely advice from government in doing so.
Thank you very much. I think we should have time for another round, I would say, of questions, if everyone's happy with that. Very good. Yes, I'll start with you two there, the first ones I saw. Striped jumper, if that's, go first. Go for it.
Thank you so much for your insightful thoughts. My name is Heise. I am a King's alumni, former visiting researcher of the Department of International Development here. And I would like to ask you how, first, if you have figures and conclusions about the presence of visitors at the UK's universities, and also how important do you think visitors are in the British system, and how they can contribute to diversity and knowledge in the UK system?
Okay. Thank you very much. And your question?
Hi, my name is Maria and I work at King's Careers and Employability. So I've heard you all talk about a sustainable model for international students at university. I naturally think of the graduate labour market for international students. Now, speaking to many employers, a lot of the pushback we get is that they find it very hard to sponsor international students. They find that really quite difficult. When international students graduate, they have two options. They can either go down the graduate visa route, which they will automatically get upon graduation, or they can go down the skilled worker route, which employer will have to sponsor. How do we navigate this, ensuring that there is enough supply for international students when there are very limited places and competition is very fierce for them compared to domestic students who don't have to overcome this challenge?
Thank you very much. And go for it.
Thank you. I've been fascinated by this debate. It's been nuanced and subtle. My question is actually rather more basic. This morning I'm sitting here and it just occurred to me, as we talk about espionage, that we're sitting in the college where Rosalind Franklin herself and a US overseas research student revealed this structure of DNA.
Yes.
It happened that two gentlemen from Cambridge had also snuck into the lecture room. They are, but they get the credit for it. So it's not a new thing. But my question is this, and it is quite true, and it goes to the 41 billion. It's about messaging. And if the newspapers are wishing to make a big thing out of students from overseas being immigrants, then how is it that the sector is going to change the narrative from it being about, are these numbers part of the 250,000 or 125,000 or whatever it is, cap on immigration, or are they a 41 billion pound export? I put that very crudely. But how are you going to change the narrative? Because that's what's got to happen if you're going to overcome what the man on the Clapham omnibus thinks of the overseas student population in this country.
Great stuff. Okay, I'm going to be sneaky and take one more question. Okay, you were the first, Steve. you raised your hand very fast, so I thought it was like you seized the opportunity. Get it.
Thanks. Sorry, my name is Patrick. I'm a reporter at the Times Higher Education. I just want to get the panel's thoughts on the King's speech this afternoon, if I could. Were you surprised to hear that the government was taking this opportunity that it had to speak to the country to criticise poor-quality university degrees? And is that the right message that this country wants to be sending to the world and to your competitors? And how much damage do you think that's going to do to the country?
Great set of questions. I'll hand to Tania first.
Well, I'll comment on the one I know best. It's the visitors and visiting PhDs and visitor fellows. We have quite a few of them, as you know. You were one of them, and a good route. We don't start joint programs or joint PhDs directly. We always start partnerships by exchanging visitors, visiting fellows, visitor PhDs, visiting academics. And so we have split site PhDs that it's mandatory that our students spend some 6 months a partner institution and vice versa. I think this is a model that our partners, especially in the Global South, are very keen, because it builds supervisory capacity. So we are going to do more of those. It's a successful model for us. Our PhD academy that we are developing in Africa is based on visiting students that come and also have internships and projects driven by industry, and vice versa. When they go to Africa, our students are interacting with industry there and problems in Africa. And I'll leave the other questions to my colleagues here. Thank you.
Right, Steve, go for it.
Okay, I've been pondering these. So the data on visitors, you mean international students, Isa, generally, what, 600,000? We've reached the target. By the way, both Canada and Australia have about similar numbers, even though they're much smaller countries in terms of population. So in terms of actual intensity of international students, there are other countries out there that are higher, if that makes sense in any way. Obviously, I view them as enriching. Barriers to visa. It's interesting. Here's the things that you already know this. I'm sure, Maria, you've seen some of the, the larger companies don't really have a problem navigating the system. It's interesting. So that's interesting. I perceive they're much more comfortable with it, and that's interesting. Okay, so the real problem, a bigger problem is SMEs. And the smaller the company, the more they either don't know about the graduate route, they don't know the choices that are available to them, and they're very reluctant to take on international students. Some of the things that we think help their employability is whether they've had work experience, often as part of the degree. We, as in the UK, tends not to offer work experience masters with integral work experience. Because they're quite short, and they're often marketed on the basis that they're short, as distinct from, say, being 2 years. It might be something to ponder as we think about how to make our offer attractive and appealing to not just the students themselves, but to audiences.
Apprenticeships. I'm going to put that one out there. If you want work experience and study, apprenticeships.
Yes. As the person who's working on apprenticeships now at Sussex, I think they are a wonderful bit of the armory and a wonderful bit of the portfolio. They're also extremely highly regulated, and that's actually, if you want to see the expansion of apprenticeships, I think we have to have a new way of regulating them. But I think they're a wonderful idea. How do you change the narrative? I think it's. So I'll speak very personally. I think one of the things that's difficult for universities is speaking personally, we complain endlessly. By comparison with further education, for example, we are rich beyond belief. I think we need to come up with better ideas ourselves. I had the misfortune one time of sitting next to somebody from a further education college, and I had a good moan about how hard life was in the university sector, and then of course turns over to some, and the same is true actually in a lot of university sectors. Go back to Canada, the college system is much more under pressure. So I think step one is to acknowledge that we have resources at our disposal. It is tight. I do not disagree. But the man on the Clapham omnibus is not going to believe that King's College London is going to go bankrupt. And he or she will not believe that Sussex is going to go bankrupt. So let's try and be a bit more creative and meet and acknowledge that those criticisms are sort of out there. That's the best I can do for now. Poor quality university degrees, I know that, so my concern is this. We all want high quality provision. I think the UK has an outstanding reputation for that. And it's a credit to all the system. I worry about the narrative, not so much because it might damage our reputation. I worry about that, but I worry even more that what it will do, it will create incentives for universities to not take difficult routes. Access and participation, well, let's at the margin cut those. Let's try and minimize our risk to non-traditional students from disadvantaged backgrounds, because we don't know how that's going to show up in the data. If you go, London is a wonderful example of this. In London, you have institutions like King's, you have institutions like University of Westminster, which does an outstanding job of reaching out and giving people opportunities that they would not necessarily have had elsewhere. I think it's something we should be very, very proactive and proud of. But we have to make sure we have robust regulation and robust outcomes. And I think given the number of things I fill out and things I attest to around our progression, I'm confident that we do across the board.
Great stuff, Joe.
Thanks very much. On the poor quality degrees one, look, I mean, this is a continuation of language that we've been hearing for quite some time. So in that sense, not very new. I mean, it's a continuation of the dog whistles to the culture warriors. That's the basic intent. In terms of actual policy, harder to see where the government's going to take this in terms of devising policies that can withstand challenge. The Office for Students has processes to assess quality through the Teaching Excellence and Student Outcomes Framework, through the B3 metrics, and they are well understood in the sector, and where the regulator has needs to take action in terms of conditions of registration requiring improvement to quality, it's doing that. And that's the kind of process which should be followed. So I think the government is obviously doing damage to the sector by these sort of broadsides against it, and it's not serving the interests of the sector as a whole. I would be really worried if this were a presage of the reimposition of student number controls as part of a pushback against the expansion of the sector at a time when the participation gap between the most advantaged quintile and the least advantaged quintile is still around 30 percentage points. We've got to be really wary about a policy that would throw the engines of social mobility through higher education into reverse with a move such as that. So I hope very much that this isn't that this line in the Queen's speech isn't softening us up for an attempt to reimpose number controls. Obviously, though, where there are quality issues, it's right that the regulator, the Office for Students, does in a proportionate way, take action to uphold the reputation of this great sector, and cracking down on institutions that require improvement in any of the ways it identifies is really important. So I'm not wishing to sound complacent. Where there are quality problems, by all means, pile on in and sort them out. On the question about narrative and the 41 billion, is this an export or do we accept that it's immigration? I think this is a really important issue that the sector needs to think about in how it communicates to the wider public. Hitherto, the narrative has been around this is an export and it's about soft power. Those are the two selling points of international students to the broader public and to the political system. When you start shifting the narrative to actually this is about our skills needs and about our UK productivity challenge, then you're shifting onto much more complicated terrain. And the sector hasn't traditionally wanted to position itself in that way for obvious reasons. The focus has been on exports and soft power and stuff which is easier to get through the mainstream media.
Thank you very much. I think that is our... Oh no, do you remember more time?
We have 5 minutes. But
we have 5 minutes. Okay.
But I'm happy to pass my turn on the question if someone else has one.
Do we have 3 rapid-fire questions which we can take and have 3 rapid-fire responses from the panel? One. I think you had one as well? All right. Okay, we'll take you first, then you, and then Mike at the end. Go for it. Very quickly.
Yes, very quickly. My name is Lima, and I'm currently visiting a scholar, originally from Humboldt University in Berlin. I was wondering, do you see any differences in the internationalization between STEM and social
Great question. Your question?
Yes, Joseph Aguilar, King's alumnus, and self-serving question about employability. I'm back now with my partner who's doing a PhD here, and so I have a spouse visa, and after 18 months, I haven't been able to get a job here, even though I can work. So my question is there an unconscious bias or conscious bias about hiring a spouse with the right to work here?
Good question. And Mike, your question.
So, Mike Mavramatis from ResPublica. Marius would have heard this question before in other context, but I'm all about collaboration and whether something can be done from the sector or from the House of Lords, from the House of Commons to make essentially DFE speak better with State Department and all the relevant departments to make things easier or better for students who are coming here from abroad.
Great stuff. Now I invite the panel to turn their answers to these questions into their full... Okay. Tania.
Well, quickly, no, there is no difference in internationalization between STEM and social sciences and humanities. It's equally distributed in terms of the international academics and students. Of course, the concentration of international PhD students is higher in STEM subjects, but we don't see any differences in the internationalization plans between our different faculties. That's for sure. And in terms of employability, only in my office, I have two. There are spouses of PhD students. So it's please do. We certainly don't. Actually, we are making great use of these possibilities. And from our point of view, I think indeed we must get better at narratives and being at the front of the wave and not ignoring concerns. We have to address them and sometimes get off this ideal world that we shouldn't be bothered with these other concerns, because true, obviously they are not valid, but go and explain why they are not valid. Make your case better. We haven't been very good at it, really. So here's my final words. Let's get better at the narrative and the good that higher education and research can do globally to all of us.
Excellent. Steve, your response and final words.
Quickly, thank you. Social science, STEM differences. I would agree with Tania. There's not much in it. I would say this. I perceive, in terms of capacity building across the globe, there's considerably more interest in STEM-related subjects or applied social science. So I think that has some modest implications for institutional strategies around internationalization. Sounds like you've been sorted on the spousal visa thing, so that's fine. Better collaboration, I think, amongst directorates and in the political system. Yeah, I'm all for some stability. The university governance, in terms of political leadership, has been passed around a fair bit, and of course it's currently split. And I think there's an argument for consolidating and some stability, which would allow us to orient some of our, let's call it lobbying, political advocacy for the long term, and perhaps a little less firefighting and a little less being reactive and defensive.
That's a good note. And very finally, Joe.
Well, I don't really have much more to say other than, international students are one of our great national assets. The sector has a few things to do, I think, to move to a more sustainable model. And I think that's crucial if we're going to maintain a political consensus that enables more international students to benefit from the excellent higher education on offer here in the UK.
That's a good note to end on. Thank you very much to our panel. Thank you all for coming.